video. Today we're going to be covering the American Civil War. Alright, so without further ado, we need to look at those big questions up on the screen now. What is a civil war? A civil war is a war that is fought between the people that live in a country. So over the history of the world, there's been a couple of major civil wars. There's been the United States Civil War, which we all know. Spain had a Spanish Civil War. That was in the early 1900s. It was around World War II era. There was I believe there was a French Civil War. So there's been some big civil wars in some pretty big countries. But a civil war basically is a war that's fought between either a group of people and the government, or the government. It's basically a war that's fought between a group of people and the government. But in the case of the American Civil War, it's fought between the government and the states that succeed. Alright, so first thing we're going to look at is the Union versus the Confederacy. So on the right here, you have the Union, which is the guy holding the flag. That represents the Union, and on the left is the flag of the Confederacy. So those are the states that left the Union, the United States. And this happened in 1861. And those were the Confederacy was the states that ended up leaving because they didn't want slavery to be abolished. So here's another picture that shows you sort of what they dressed like. So the Confederates, usually because, Union had a majority of the textile factories, were sort of dressed in more like raggedy looking clothing. And the Unions had actual nice military uniforms. So now we're looking at some of the causes for the Civil War. So cause number one, the election of Abraham Lincoln. So yeah, in 1860, President Lincoln was elected to office. He was a Republican from Illinois. His vice president was Andrew Johnson. And when he got elected, he made all these promises to abolish slavery. So this really sort of fueled the fire for succession of the southern states in the Civil War happening. And yeah, so here, this is sort of along the same lines where they just said the southern states felt that they were being bullied by the northern states when Lincoln was elected. And there's a picture of Abraham Lincoln on the right. So yeah, so we're going to look here at this map here. So this is going to show the vote and how it worked. This is the electoral, I don't know if it's the electoral college map for the 1860 presidential election. So everything that's purple went Republican. Everything that's orange went Southern. Went Democratic, sorry. So yeah, there were some Democratic states that were Democratic Southern, which is all the orange. Democratic Northern is all the solid green, so I believe it's just on this one there's only one that went Democratic Northern, and that was, I think it's Missouri. And then half of New Jersey went Democratic Northern. Constitutional Union, that looks like it was West Virginia. Kentucky and Tennessee. And then the one that was divided, as I said before, was New Jersey. So yeah, so you can see all the statistics here. I'll let you guys look at this for a second. It's a really cool map, and it's really cool thing just to soak up. And then everything that's in that sort of gray-brown would be unorganized territory, or believe it or not, what they called, when I post my video on Western Expansion, which will be coming out soon, the Great American Desert. Cause 2 was the states' rights regarding taxation and slavery. So yeah, at this time there's a lot of unrest about slavery and if it was going to be continued, because in the original Constitution, slavery was allowed. There's nothing that prohibited slavery. They said it was allowed, and then taxation had always been something that's been fought over a lot between the North and the South. So the nullification crisis. Nullify means to ignore. In 1832, South Carolina said that they could nullify federal law by simply ignoring it. So President Andrew Jackson threatened to send federal troops. So South Carolina ended up calming down and chilled for now. So abolitionism. So yeah, so abolitionism is the term to describe people who stood up against slavery and really disliked it. So I think that those are some famous faces you might recognize. That have to do with abolitionism. And abolitionists is the proper term for the people who disliked slavery. So Frederick Douglass was one big abolitionist, and he was the editor of an abolitionist newspaper. And then, on a side note, are they related? Harriet Tubman is another abolitionist. She helped slaves escape via the Underground Railroad. John Brown. This is he and his sons brutally murdered 5 slave masters in Kansas. So this is another abolitionist, and they tried in 1858, and they tried to incite a slave revolt. So sort of a slavery revolution. And finally, the last cause of the Civil War was slavery. So let's look here at the Compromise of 1850. So free state or territory is everything in green here on the map. Yellow is going to be a slave state or territory. And then orangey red will be an opened to slavery by principle of popular sovereignty. So Utah and Mexico, they weren't really classified as a slave state or not. Slave states or not. It was, some people had slaves, some people didn't. Everything green, there was no slavery at. Everything yellow, there was slaves. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1811 to 1896. So this is the lady who started the Civil War. That's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in the first year. 2 million in a decade. So yeah, she wrote this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin that had to do with slavery, and it was really it hit hard for a lot of people. So cause 5 was sectionalism. So we look here, it says the Civil War. The gray states were the Confederate states. The Union states were the light blue. And the dark blue is Union territories. So the light blue is everything that the Union controlled. The dark blue basically was, they weren't states yet, they were just territories that the Union had control of. And then the gray, reddy, browny color was the Confederate States. So the 1860 election, a nation, national, something like that. Sectionalism at its worst. Senator Charles Sumner, Republican from Massachusetts. Congressman Preston Brooks, a Democrat from South Carolina. So the war begins. When the war begins, it was the firing on Fort Sumner. And here's a little picture of it. So states started succeeding, and the first state to succeed was Virginia, and then South Carolina followed after that. And I believe Fort Sumner was in South Carolina, or no, one of the two. And basically what happened was it still was housing Union troops. The Confederate Army, which was beginning to amass, was mad about that. So they gathered up some cannons and decided, we're going to attack it. So they attacked it, and this is what really started the war. And then Abraham Lincoln started to send troops in. So Fort Sumner, April 12th, 1861. So here's another picture of Fort Sumner. So it's on an island. So the progress of secession. So the Union states are all in red. The border slave states that did not succeed from the United States would be Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. States that succeeded after the fall of Fort Sumner: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. And the states that succeeded before the fall of Fort Sumner was all these bottom ones. So South Carolina, Georgia, Atlanta, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. So the first states to succeed. So yeah, look at this map here. This is a nation divided, 1861, 1865. The blue ones are the United States of America. So that's all in the north, really, plus Kansas, Oregon, and California. The Confederate states were all in the gray. So that was Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. So the border states, and this were Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri were the border states. So the advantages of the Union North. They had double the population, which was true because the majority of people wanted to live in the North where it was easier to make money, and they had sort of some cities that were established. New York was a big city at this time, Boston. And yeah, they had a lot more railroads in the North as well. But during this time, Abraham Lincoln did have them working on the Transcontinental Railroad, which is true. And yeah, they had a lot more factories so they could produce a lot more goods. Good. Now we're going to look at the rebel advantages for the South. So the Confederates had the best generals. So one of the best generals at the time was Robert E. Lee. And he was actually asked to fight for the Union. However, he lived in Virginia, and Virginia succeeded with the Confederacy. And he was like, I've got to stay with my state. Defending is always easier than attacking. Yeah, because you have more to worry about doing defensive line instead of having to figure out like where I'll put these guys, where I'll put this regiment here and here. So farmers fight better than factory workers. Yeah, so farmers would fight better than factory workers because they're used to having to defend their crops from wild animals. So they already know how to fire a gun. A factory worker, they don't really know how to fire a gun. So you're going to have to teach them all these things. So yeah, so the first metal ships in the world. So this is what's kind of cool, is you see the first battleships starting to appear during this time. And a lot of these battleships were basically just steamboats. And during this time, steel was invented. Or a little bit prior to the Civil War. So a lot of them were just steamboats with a bunch of steel slapped to them, with little square holes cut out to make for the cannons. And yeah, those are just some of the guns they used back in the day. They had Colt was actually around. It was a big gun manufacturer back in the day, and it still is today. And you can see some of the cool little guns. So yeah, this was Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it was basically a speech that he gave after the Battle of Gettysburg. And here's a little. So I kind of lied. So here's a little more about the Emancipation Proclamation. So it freed the slaves in only the states that have seceded from the Union. It did not free slaves in the border states. 1863. Emancipation equals freedom. Gettysburg. So yeah, we had the Union General Meade and Robert E. Lee facing off in the Battle of Gettysburg, which lasted from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. Gettysburg was a turning point. Gettysburg is the largest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Over 100,000 people died in 3 days. It was the last time the South invaded the North. And yeah, here's the little picture. Another picture. So the Gettysburg Address. And here's a little bit about the Gettysburg Address, which is also the Emancipation Proclamation that Abraham Lincoln delivered when he visited Gettysburg after the battles of Gettysburg. And it said that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom in the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln. And if you did not know this, I already told this, but Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Technology made the Civil War. So yeah, it did. So this is another picture of one of the armored boats, the Monitor. And then they had, they had better technology, so they were able to make better cannons, better weaponry. Yeah, so here's just some pictures of what they were able to do. So you had the classic cannon, you had the cannonball on the far left. In the middle, you started seeing more of this ammunition-shaped metal used as a cannon. And I'm pretty sure towards the end, we'll keep seeing these technological advancements. So yeah, the Battle of Vicksburg was a very unique battle. So the Battle of Vicksburg was a battle versus the Union versus the Confederates, as we know, and it was over one of the major towns on the west, on sort of the westerly side of the border states. It was in Mississippi. It was on the Mississippi River. So it was a pretty big port hub for the Confederates. And what happened was the siege of Vicksburg, which was headed by General Ulysses Grant, who further became the president later. And basically what happened is they attacked the capital of Mississippi, which I can't think of right now. We'll come back to that. But basically they attacked the capital of Mississippi, and after they did that, they were able to come back because they defeated all the Confederate troops there, so they knew there was going to be no reinforcements, and they came back and dug in around Vicksburg. However, what made Grant's fighting style unique for this one is he tried to go with the siege tactic, which it did work in the end. So what he did is he had his troops dig a trench around Vicksburg in a horseshoe shape, and he had half of his men facing towards Vicksburg. And then he had his men dig another trench in a horseshoe shape facing away from Vicksburg, and he had the other half of his men looking back from towards the capital to make sure that if any Confederate reinforcements did come, they'd be able to fire and protect the other guys who were in the middle of this siege. So the siege lasted for a couple of weeks, believe it or not. And there was a lot of cannon bombardment from the cannons they had on the land. And another thing that Grant used was he was good friends with one of the generals of the Navy at this time, the Union Navy. So he was able to get the Union Navy to go down the Mississippi and fire their cannons as well at Vicksburg. So a lot of people ended up dying. The army really began to starve. The Confederate army began to starve at their base in Vicksburg. And a lot of Vicksburg's citizens actually started to starve as well. And they were basically eating anything they could find, rats, mice. And they actually ended up, a lot of Vicksburg residents, leaving their houses, if you can believe this. And they would try to make little indentations and hide in like little caves underground. So we'd like dig into the side of the hills because it was safer than being up above on land with all the cannon fire. So that's a little bit about the Battle of Vicksburg. If you want to watch, if you want to know more about the Siege of Vicksburg, I will put a video. It's really informational. Link will be in the description of this video. So yeah, here's another picture of the Battle of Vicksburg. And some more Civil War pictures. So yeah, Confederates were dead, and I should mention that during this era of time, we also had the first black and white cameras developed as well. So these are some actual pictures. So oh yeah, over 618,000 military deaths occurred in the Civil War. And there's another picture. The 54th Regiment attacks Fort Wagner, South Carolina, in 1863. So yeah, I think we're gonna take a closer look at the 54th Regiment. So yeah, blacks in the military. So this time we saw a lot of African Americans actually being able to join the military. However, they were fighting in separate ranks. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, the African Americans began to join the army. Initially, they were only used for manual labor, but eventually they saw combat. And the first African American regiment was the 54th, Massachusetts 54th Regiment, which was the first all-black American regiment. Yeah. William McCartney was the leader of that. After 4 bloody years, the Civil War, the South was defeated. The Civil War ended when Lee surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So the result of Reconstruction at the time of rebuilding this country after the Civil War. Reconstruction Amendments was the 13th Amendment, freed slaves. 14th Amendment, everyone was born and citizen, the due process of all law of citizens. And the 15th, black male suffrage. Remember the Reconstruction Amendments this way, free citizens vote. Lincoln's assassinated, yeah. So Lincoln got assassinated in the last year of the Civil War, right as it was beginning to clear up, he did get assassinated. Punishment of the killers and conspirators. And yeah, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment. I'll try my best to answer them. Make sure you guys like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll come out with a new video in a day or two. Thank you guys. You guys are the best viewers in the whole entire planet. I hope you guys enjoy.